shorter time, and I know that some of the slides that I have here, a lot of the stuff's been addressed by some of the previous speakers, and I know that some of the upcoming speakers are going to talk about some of the same things too. One thing I do want to qualify before I start is that I'm going to largely talk about all invasive species. I am the aquatics invasive species person for our policy group in Peterborough, but our policies cover basically all invasive species. Unlike the federal government, where different TACs are covered by different agencies, M&R pretty much covers all invasive species. So just very quickly, why is invasive species a big concern to M&R? We often hear that, we're, compared to some of the other provinces, we're doing a lot of invasive species stuff, and why are we so wrapped up in it? We have more invasive species than any of the other provinces do. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Partly it's the nature of our geography. We have this wonderful inland waterway that comes right into the middle of Ontario. We share that with the United States, and it's been a way that a lot of invasive species have come in. We have our society, we have a large population, it's a very affluent society, so they can afford extra little things like aquarium plants and things like that. They can have these extra pet species, things like that. Our economy, again, going back to that inland waterway, 50% of the internationally shipped containers that come into Canada are opened up in the Great Lakes region. And it also has to do with the state of our ecosystem. We have a lot of population, and along with that, we have a lot more disturbed ecosystems than some of the other provinces do. So the conclusion that we've come up with is that basically we have probably been at a greater risk than some of the other provinces, and we probably will continue to be at a greater risk. I'm going to go very quickly through this because I think most of the people who are dealing with invasive species know what the impacts are of invasive species. In Ontario, we see, like everywhere else, we see the biodiversity impacts, we see those economic impacts, and we see societal impacts. So a couple of the things to highlight along with that societal stuff is that we have seen that more of the public attention with the Asian carp due to some of the injured boaters in the U.S. And people saying that that's affecting their recreation. Reduced aesthetic values and reduced property values due to the presence of invasive species, as well as some of the offsets of tourism of having invasive species. And one of the examples that we have is koi herpes virus that killed a large number of fish in the Forth area a few years ago, and saying that had affected tourism values. I'm going to go through a bit of where our invasive species program has come from. We have had a program for a while, but it's also nested through our biodiversity strategies, which this slide is meant to demonstrate how our biodiversity strategy is nested in the Canadian strategy, which is further nested in the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, and that all of these documents do have references to needing to deal with the invasive species problem. Our biodiversity strategy was authored by the Ontario Biodiversity Council, and this is not just Ontario government people. This is a number of volunteers that come from NGOs, government, academia, Aboriginal organizations, and industry groups. And they have produced this strategy that is meant to be for all of Ontario. As well, this strategy has a number of targets that are set. So specifically, target number 7 says that we will reduce the threats posed by invasive species, and there are actions under these targets, and one of the key actions is number 20, to continue to enhance the measures of prevention, early detection, rapid response, and management, which we've seen in some of the presentations already today. In response to this strategy that's put together by this larger organization of Ontario groups, then the government has a response plan that's called Biodiversity. It's in our nature, and this is really the Ontario government plan to conserve biodiversity. It's developed by the Ontario Public Service Biodiversity Network, which is a collaboration of 15 ministries, but it's been led by M&R. And again, there are certain actions in this document that refer to the need to deal with invasive species and commitments of what we would like to do. So that brings us to our invasive species strategic plan. So the Canadian Action Plan to address the threat of aquatic invasive species of 2004, which was talked about this morning, recognized the need for joint federal provincial leadership and recommended developing provincial and territorial action plans. M&R took the lead on this, and in collaboration with our Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, which has now been split into, and so the food being taken by just the Ministry of Agriculture and Food, the Ministry of the Environment, and the Ministry of Transportation in Ontario, basically lays out a management framework that we are going to use to address invasive species in the province. This plan establishes that that M&R will be the lead for Ontario to deal with coordinating invasive species actions. However, there are certain management actions that are prescribed to the other three ministries. So this is just sort of a schematic diagram showing that how the mandates of the different ministries do intersect on this invasive species file. M&R being the lead for species that have an impact on biodiversity, on forests, wildlife, and aquatics in the province. Agriculture and food deals mostly with species that are going to impact agricultural operations, whether that be crops or livestock. MOE has their part with dealing with control measures and permitting. And the Ministry of Transportation, they have their part with highway corridors, border crossing, land at the border crossings, and marine systems that they work with Transport Canada on. So some of the key actions that have been outlined in OISIP, the Ontario Invasive Species Strategic Plan, and we'll go through some of these very quickly. I did put a lot more of the bullet points from the plan in for the science and monitoring parts, figuring that might be of additional interest to some of the people that are here. But I guess suffice it to say that all of the key actions would have a series of actions, activities, and targets to meet. I've just gone into a little bit more detail about the one. The plan does talk about needing leadership and intergovernmental cooperation, so to work with the federal government to clarify who is the lead for what, the need for straightening out legislation, regulations, policies to deal with invasive species, so to look at things that may impede prevention or rapid response. Some of the science actions that were identified was to develop risk assessments and risk analysis tools, undertake surveillance activities in high-risk areas, improving monitoring programs, and developing networks that will help to identify those species when they are found. We need to engage science in order to develop better surveillance protocols. How do we find things rapidly or find things early so that we can actually respond to them? We need more information on how to eradicate or prevent species, do a better job of that. Additional research that will help us predict the impacts of invasive species, and as well as predict the impacts of climate change on the ability of species to establish in the province and create impacts. And again, just quickly going through some of the other key activities that were identified in the plan, the risk assessment and risk analysis stuff, so this overlaps a lot with the science parts. Development of management measures, again, there's a lot of overlap with some of the science needs for developing better management tools, and of course communication and education highlighting some of the good work that's been done in the past, our important partnerships that we've had with, for many, many years with the Federation of Anglers and Hunters, as well as opportunities for additional partnerships to deal with communications around invasive species. So one of the things that came out of our out of the strategic plan was the need to look additionally into what are the legislative tools that we have available to us. And we worked with CAISN HQP, Dr. Andrea Smith to do this work, and she worked with along with Normian and Steppenwood at Osgood Hall Law School. And I think Andrea's going to be up here shortly to give you more details on that, so I'm not going to steal her thunder on the details and stuff like that, but just suffice it to say that she did identify some gaps in the federal and provincial legislation. So that's kind of led us to where we've been at lately. So drivers for Bill 167, that's the Proposed Invasive Species Act, that has been referenced a couple of times in talks this morning. So there's a number of drivers. It's the socioeconomic and biodiversity impacts that we've been talking about. The current gaps that were identified in the legislative and regulatory approach that we've been using, as well as a number of government commitments that have come forward recently. There's been group meeting, the Council of Great Lakes Governors. They've invited the Premiers of Ontario and Quebec to be involved, and they've come up with a least wanted list of invasive species that the provinces and the states agree that they are going to deal with. There's also things like the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement that we're signatory to, and the Canada-Ontario Agreement concerning the Great Lakes ecosystem. As well, we've been hearing from a number of stakeholders that that we need to be doing more, and we've done a lot of outreach and education in the past, but there's room for more to be done. So, in response to these drivers and threats, the government has introduced Bill 167, the Invasive Species Act 2014. And the idea behind this is that we want to provide ourselves a strong legislative framework to be able to better prevent, detect, rapidly respond, and eradicate species and manage them where we have to. It promotes some shared accountability for managing invasive species. We know that there's more than one ministry involved. We know that we have to work with our partners at the federal level, as well as with other groups, whether they be NGOs, the conservation authorities do a lot of work. So I think that it enables being able to work with a lot of these other groups. We also want to be able to hold those responsible accountable for costs for control and eradication. So that can be through strong penalties for people who are not following the regulations, as well as there are provisions that are being put forward for cost recovery. We will be using a risk-based approach that will consider a full range of the threats, costs, and benefits to the environment, society, and the economy of Ontario when considering listing species. As well as we look at this as being legislation that will allow us to complement the role of the federal government. We by no means want to take over the work that they are doing or to infringe upon it, but this is something that we think is necessary in order to help us manage the full suite of invasive species. So right from aquatic species through to terrestrial plants and animals and such. So Bill 167 was introduced February 26th for the first reading. It went to second reading on April the 8th. The second reading went longer than expected, I guess you might say, and had to be interrupted. So that will be continued sometime in the near future. The next step is that something like this will normally go to standing committee, where all three of the main parties in Ontario that sit in the legislature will have an opportunity to look at the different provisions that are in the Act and provide comment on them. One thing that we think puts us in fairly good standing is that all three parties have come forward publicly and said that they do in principle support the act, and that that they think that it's a good piece, and that they're looking at it more from tweaks rather than they disagree with the entire principle of the act. So we think that's a good thing. So once the bill also establishes an enabling framework, which will provide us the legislative tools and regulatory powers required to manage invasive species in Ontario. So a couple of things that are worth highlighting though is that no species or carriers or pathways are going to be listed right in the bill itself. These will all be covered in regulation after the bill does, assuming that the bill does go through the legislature and is approved and becomes an act. We will be, when we go to do regulations that may list species, we will be considering a number of considerations, such as the species' biological characteristics, the risk of harm to the natural environment or to the economy, its dispersal ability and other socioeconomic factors. So basically, all of these factors are the type of things that will be considered in risk assessments when we look to list species. So any kind of regulation that we do produce is going to have to involve public and stakeholder consultations, much like Tracy talked about for the AIS regulations. That would be the opportunity where industry would have their input as well as the public on any possible regulation. Just one final note on that is that significant policy work and engagement is going to be needed to support implementation of that act. So one of the examples is for risk assessment. We are going to have to develop some kind of policy. We don't want to be tied to having to do all sorts of risk assessments on our own. A lot of that work has been done. DFO, for example, has done a lot of the fish risk assessment. So we will need to develop policy of, when are we going to accept other people's risk assessments? When are we going to be doing our own? So DFO has done a lot of work on screening level for aquatics, and we don't want to redo all that good work that's been done. Just sort of a very brief overview of the setup of the bill is that it has definitions. There's parts about listing and processes for listing species, classes, developing classes of species and carriers. There's outlining what kind of prohibitions can apply to species, carriers, and the classes of species. There are provisions for exceptions, so authorizations for science, for education, and for management purposes. The ability to enter into agreements that can spell out exceptions, so that if we enter into an agreement with the Conservation Authority to do a management program, that they can then have some authority to possess a species for the purpose of eradicating it. There are exceptions for creating prevention and response plans that can spell out some of those exceptions, as well as those exceptions can be in regulation. There is stuff in there about inspection and enforcement powers, as well as a number of administrative processes. And I see that I am running close on my end of time, and I have room for time for questions, though, I think. And if anybody wants to talk more about the details of the act or of the proposed act, the bill, and what's in it, but by all means, feel free to approach me on the break.
You have a picture of invasive and endangered species. We have time for a question or two. I think the post-lunch drowsiness is setting in. Shouldn't have planted that seed. Okay, thanks very much.
I will be around at break if anybody wants to talk.
Perfect. Thanks, John.